Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for coming. Before I start, I want to thank Mara and everyone else who was involved in my becoming an honorary doctor at Stockholm University. It's really quite an honor, and I am very appreciative of the effort that went into that, and just simply the recognition of my work, but also my participation and interaction with those of you here at Stockholm University that I find very rewarding. And so thank you all. So I'm going to talk today about quality and inclusive early childhood programs. And what I'm going to try to do is actually several things in a short amount of time, and I hope that you'll be able to follow along. But the good thing is that after I finish speaking, then we'll have an opportunity for you to think about what that might mean in your own work and what the implications are for Sweden and the Swedish context. Because, of course, I am from the United States, and the work that I'm going to be talking about today is work that was undertaken in the United States, and even the recommended practices, which when I explain, they come from an international organization, but it's not all that international. It very much has a United States perspective, and it's really always interesting to me to hear from folks who may not share that same perspective and how you interpret those practices, whether or not they make sense in your context, and how those of us in the United States should be thinking perhaps differently about things like inclusion and recommended practices. But I'll start us off, and I'm going to talk about effective instructional practices for young children with disabilities in inclusive settings. And I also hope that you'll learn about the development and the future of what we call recommended practices in early intervention, early childhood special education. But I'm going to start actually with a little bit of historical context from a US perspective, and then talk a little bit about inclusion, because that's really the basis for the work that I'll talk about. So when we think about the legal and the policy perspective of early intervention and early childhood special education in the United States, there has always been a strong preference for inclusion in law and in policy. Our law was passed, our special education law was passed in the mid-1970s for children, school-age children. For children younger than school age, the law was passed in the mid-1980s. For school-age children, but for both groups, we did not use the word inclusion, interestingly enough. The law says children should be placed in their least restrictive environment for children kindergarten and older. And least restrictive environment means to the degree possible in those environments in which children who are typically developing, who do not have disabilities, are enrolled. For the very youngest children, the law refers to natural environments. And once again, those are environments that typically developing children are participating in. But it also includes a wider variety of home and community settings. So that's part of the background. Another part of the background that I always have to emphasize, especially when I'm in Scandinavia and when I'm in Europe, and that is that there is no system of early childhood care and education in the United States. So it is a hodgepodge, it's a mess, it's a mix of all sorts of programs and services and state-funded programs and locally community-based programs. And so unlike Sweden, where almost all of the young children will enter into your universal preschool or early childhood programs, that it's almost automatic. that there will be a place for a young child. That is not true in the United States. So we have child care programs, we have state-funded preschool, we have a federally funded program for children who are growing up in poverty. That's called Head Start. So these programs are all just a little bit different. They're different in terms of eligibility. They're different in terms of whether they're offered at no cost or some cost or entirely parent pay through tuition. And so the bottom line is that there's no system. Now, for children with disabilities and other special needs who are eligible, there is a system. It comes from the federal government, operated through the states at the local level. But we managed to make this more complicated than it should be also. So for infants and toddlers, that effort is administered by any of a variety of public agencies at the governor's determination. So in my state, it's run by the state of Washington. It's run by the Department of Children, Family, and Youth. In other states, it's run by education. In other states, it's run by public health. So that can make a difference in how those services look and operate. But for preschoolers, children 3 and older, it's always the Department of Education. So, as I said, we managed to make things as complicated as they could be, but that gives you some background. When I talk about some of the practices and why we pay attention to certain things, it's because of this kind of background about where children are served and where families are entering the process. Okay, we're going to start with inclusion. And this is a definition that is shared by 2 of our professional organizations, the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which is the largest organization, and that is primarily for teachers and other professionals who work in general early childhood in all of its permutations. And it's also a joint position with the Division for Early Childhood that you'll learn a little bit about in a moment. And that's the division that focuses specifically on young children with disabilities and other special needs. So this is what our definition says. Early childhood inclusion embodies the values, policies, and practices that support the right of every infant and young child and his or her family, regardless of ability, to participate in a broad range of activities and contexts as full members of families and communities and society. And more. The desired results of inclusive experiences for children with and without disabilities and their families include a sense of belonging and membership, positive social relationships and friendships, and development and learning to reach their full potential. So we think about those as the expected outcomes of inclusion. Belonging and membership, positive social relationships, including friendships, and then, of course, development and learning to reach full potential. Next, the defining features of inclusion that can be used to identify high-quality early childhood programs and services are access, participation, and supports. And I'll describe each of those 3 features in some greater detail as I move along this afternoon. So we think about how do we ensure access, how do we ensure real participation, active participation of children and families, and what supports need to be in place for those things to happen. So right away, I expect that you're thinking that access is an interesting, probably US feature that may not be quite so important in other parts of the world where you have universal programs. But we have these 2 parallel tracks where we had programs growing in any of a variety of ways for children without disabilities. And then we have a set of programs and services and supports that grew primarily from legislation and family efforts for children with disabilities and special needs. So those are kind of moving along parallel tracks, and somehow we have to bring the children together. So that's one of the reasons why access becomes so important for us. So at least to start with, I'm going to be talking a little bit about access, what that means, participation, what that means, the supports that need to be in place in order for children to learn and thrive. About now, over 20 years ago, I was part of a group that was funded by the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, to form a group that we called the Early Childhood Research Institute on Inclusion. Dr. Sam Odom was the principal investigator of that research institute, and some of you know Sam from his work here in Stockholm. And we were a group of researchers who were located across the United States at 5 and sometimes 6 different university sites. And our charge was to identify the facilitators and the barriers to preschool inclusion. So what makes preschool or early childhood inclusion work, and then what gets in the way of early childhood inclusion. And we looked at those facilitators and barriers at administrative levels, at school and classroom levels, and we looked also at family impact and influence, and we looked at the community. And later on in my talk, I'll talk about some of the work that we did at the classroom and teacher-child interaction level, and talk about some of the results of that work. But in this effort, one of the things that we did, in addition to our sort of on-the-ground research, we also conducted systematic reviews of the literature. And at the end of the project, which lasted roughly 6 years, we synthesized the research findings to that point in time and published it in 2001. These research findings, and we refer to these as our synthesis points. These are the main takeaways, the main findings from our work and the work of others in the area of early child inclusion. So we published these in 2001, and people have returned to them with newer reviews of literature, newer projects, but they have held the test of time, and these are still generally the synthesis points, at least in US preschool inclusion. One of the things that we know is that inclusion takes many forms, and you should have guessed that already because our programs and services are so widely varied. So we had these parallel programs, and so we have both children with disabilities joining into programs that were developed for typically developing children. We also have specialized programs that have become more inclusive by enrolling more children who are typically developing. And then there are a variety of other ways that you can see inclusion play out in our communities and schools. Lots of progress has been achieved in efforts to ensure access to inclusive programs. It's in the law. The research is strongly in favor of inclusive programs. And still, at last count, about 50% of preschool children in the United States with disabilities are enrolled in inclusive programs. That means that about 50% are receiving their services in segregated, highly specialized programs. So clinics and special schools still exist. And part of the reason for that, at least in my view, is probably because of our history, and that preschool programs for children with disabilities are often located in public schools, but there are no programs for typically developing in most public schools. And so administrators in those public schools find it much easier to just have separate classrooms for the children with disabilities, because otherwise they'd have to go out into the community and interact with childcare programs, private preschool, Head Start, and all of those other programs. So maybe you could say it's just a matter of being lazy. There has been in the last 2 or 3 years a big push, a big emphasis on improving our performance when it comes to access. And there was a joint position paper put out by the Department of Education and Department of Health and Human Services at the end of the Obama administration, really calling out some of these challenges and also calling for action on the part of everyone, but especially the public schools, to make sure that inclusion happened for young children. But we're at about 50%. But at the same time, we know that children in inclusive programs generally do at least as well as children in the specialized programs, so there's no overall benefit for maintaining those specialized programs. As I've just said, all of those policies, resources, and underlying beliefs continue to influence inclusion and whether or not it happens. We also know that specialized instruction is important, and sometimes this is seen as a little bit of a barrier to inclusion, that there may be some specialized methods or practices that need to be used in order for children with disabilities or other special needs to make progress. Some more of our findings from the research. One is that collaboration is essential. Inclusion does not work without collaboration. And in our context, that means working together, teamwork, really being cooperative and collaborative across organizations and agencies, as well as all of the team members, the teachers, the therapists, and all of the people who work more intimately with the children and with the families. But we need collaboration at all of those levels. Families generally view inclusion favorably. They, in a variety of surveys and interviews and variety of studies, families generally view inclusion favorably and are often our biggest ambassadors for inclusion. When we look at the quality of the programs, inclusive programs generally score better, at least as good or better on measures, observational measures of quality of the services and the experience for the children. But repeatedly we hear that early childhood professionals, especially those who come from what I'm calling general early childhood, feel that they are not adequately prepared to meet the individual needs of children with disabilities. So here's the summary. Inclusion can benefit young children with and without disabilities, and most families view inclusion in a positive light. There are certain key factors that are critical, perhaps essential, to inclusion being successful. One is to use research-based instructional strategies, and when I talk about recommended practices, that's where this piece comes in. And so research-based instructional strategies and strong collaboration among families, teachers, specialists, and the administrators at the agency and organization level. And professional development, whether that's in-service support, teacher preparation, coaching, any of a variety of means of professional development, is a critical need. And it's increasingly recognized that this is part of the way to both increase opportunities for inclusion and to maintain inclusive efforts. Okay, so I've talked quite a bit already about this issue of access to inclusion in the United States. We have laws and policies that do support access to inclusive environments. Inclusion is considered a civil right, and in fact, that was the basis for our law passed way back in the 1970s, that it was a civil right, not just a matter of good practice. And in the 1990s, that was reiterated in a federal case, a judicial case that was brought in one of the circuit courts, and the judge ruled that inclusion is a right for all children, not just for a few. That was in his finding in a case that was about children having to be ready for inclusion or to meet certain standards or abilities to be in an inclusive program. And his findings stated very strongly that inclusion is a right and not something just for a special few. At the same time, when we talk to teachers, we visit classrooms, when we have conversations and just talk about whether or not children with disabilities are enrolled or could be enrolled or so forth, overwhelmingly, classrooms for young children are welcoming environments. And the teachers say, of course he or she can be here. We want everyone to feel welcome in our classroom. And so that basic attitude of being welcome and being part of the group is there. That's not something that we have to appreciate it, but we don't have to necessarily work on. The children are welcome. We want the children to be here and to be part of our group, but we don't quite know if what we're doing is the right thing, the best thing for these children. So can you help us out? So that's the caveat to the welcoming environment. Before I move on, I want to talk about this idea, remind you of the desired results of inclusion, that the features that we talk about are access, participation, and supports, but to what end? And whether or not inclusion is successful, we want to find out whether or not children and families feel a sense of belonging and membership, that they're part of this group of young children, whether it's their class or their play group or the children in the story hour at the library, the children who are on the soccer team together. Is there a sense of belonging and membership? Do we help children develop positive social relationships and friendships, sort of not just using their positive social skills, but in fact truly developing reciprocal relationships and having friends? That's another sign of successful inclusion. And are children continuing to develop and learn to their full potential? So that's where we get a little bit deeper into this notion of participation. What does it mean to actively participate in inclusive classrooms, inclusive learning environments, inclusive recreational sorts of activities? One of the things that we know for sure from decades of research is that just bringing the children together, having mixed groups, is not sufficient. And there needs to be some planning, some effort, some intentionality to having children socially interact with each other and to learn side by side. And so what we are now learning about individualization or of intentional instruction is that we've come to think about we need to be in a high-quality program for all children, and that for any child who has any kind of special need, whether it's a kind of a short-term challenge or a longer-term disability, we can think about levels of support. And those levels of support might be just simple modifications or adaptations or simple accommodations so that a child can truly be a part of the group and participate and learn. Then for some children, they may require just a little bit more intentionality in their instruction, and we generally now talk about that as embedded teaching or embedded instruction. And for some children, and usually just a few children, they'll need even more highly specialized instruction, and but it can still be accomplished in an inclusive environment. So we'll talk about those, particularly as they relate to the recommended practices, in a moment. Okay, so now we finally get to the recommended practices. So I'm going to have to give you some background about this work as well. So as I said, our professional organization is called the Division for Early Childhood, or DEC, and it's a division of the Council for Exceptional Children, CEC. The Council for Exceptional Children, some of you may actually be members of CEC. It's an international organization, but as I said, primarily the majority of members are in the United States. It's the professional organization of teachers and others who work on behalf of children with disabilities and other exceptional special needs. It has some subdivisions, and one of those divisions is the Division for Early Childhood, and that represents teachers and others who work on behalf of children from birth to 5 with disabilities and other special needs, children at risk for school failure or developmental delay, and their families. And in the very early 1990s, about 5 years after the law had been passed, so the law had been passed and said by the federal government that young children have access to special education and special services. There was that preference that those services would be delivered in natural environments. And in some states and in some locations, there were really no services at all for young children that were provided by schools or by any kind of public agency. Families might have been able to find services through their own medical provider, healthcare provider, or other kind of program, but in some places, there simply were no programs. So this law opened those doors and helped create programs. But at the same time, there wasn't a lot of guidance about what those programs might look like. There was research, there were demonstration projects, there were suggestions, people had ideas about what those services should look like, but there was no sort of general guidance about what those programs and services should look like. So our organization, DEC, took it upon itself to say, we need to do that. We need to be the voice of those practices that every child with a disability or at risk for school failure or developmental delay, for every child in the United States, we need to be their voice about what these programs and practices should look like. And we're going to identify those practices. Well, what is this going to look like? This was kind of early in the era of even talking about evidence-based practice or evidence-based medicine or any of those kinds of terms were sort of just beginning to be used. There wasn't anything comparable in early childhood to say, okay, we're going to do it like this. We had to kind of make it up. And we said that meant that these would be tangible lists that you could read and see what these practices are. They would be generated by looking at the best available research evidence, but also by gathering the views of those who work in the field and listening to their professional experience and their professional wisdom, and bringing those together and verifying the practices through field validation. And the idea was that it was not absolute practice. In fact, early on, we thought maybe we should call these best practices. Well, when you say best practice, it sounds like this is what I always need to do with every single child. And we know that children are individuals, and sometimes we need to make adjustments. Let's call them recommended practices. For this point in time, these are our best ideas about good practice, but it could change over time, and it may be different for individual children. So this is the very first version of those recommended practices. They became public we started the work in 1991. And one of the things that you need to know is that the Division for Early Childhood, DEC, is an all-volunteer organization. So no one was being paid to do this work. This was a group of people who said, we need to identify the practices. And how are we going to do that? Because we're not going to pay graduate students to do this. We're not going to hire people to do this. How can we do this in a way that will still allow us to identify those practices at very low cost? So we did it primarily by focus groups. And at our national conference, we gave people prior information and said, we're going to do this, and we're going to organize focus groups in all sorts of areas. We're in assessment and families and teaming and collaboration and instruction, and we had a whole list of topics. And we said, come to the conference. The day after the conference, you can be a part of a focus group. And hundreds of people actually stayed an extra day, and they participated in those focus groups. And we went through a process and had people, primarily from their knowledge of the research and their experience, identify the recommended practices. And then we sent them out for field validation. So that part was conducted with a little bit more stringent rigor. And people got the list of practices and said, is this a recommended practice or not? And then we also asked them, do you see it in everyday practice? So they were also validated. It resulted in 415 recommended practices. If you get a whole bunch of people in a room, you're going to get a whole bunch of practices. So we had 415 practices. All of them were validated. People said, yes, these are important. They should be in place. Roughly half of them were said to be actually in place on an everyday basis. So these are important. We don't always see them. The practices themselves were distributed this is a spiral-bound booklet that we published, self-published, and then a couple years later, we published another book that provided some more information about the recommended practices. So that's early 1990s. One of the criticisms of that first version was that it was not based on the research literature. We were making an assumption that the people that were in the focus groups had sufficient knowledge that they were bringing to their identification of good practice. We didn't know that for sure. So a few years later, we were fortunate to be able to compete for a grant that did provide some financial support this time around. And we launched the second version of recommended practices. And the idea was to update and improve the process for identifying practices and to conduct an extensive review of the peer-reviewed database literature. Now, any of you who have tried to do a literature review know that the research that we do about young children with disabilities or special needs is scattered all over the place, right? It's in our own journals, it's in health journals, it's in international journals, it's in smaller journals, it's everywhere. And so we asked people to nominate the journals where our research was being published. They identified more than 48, but we ended up using research from 48 journals. And we identified over 1,000 articles that were peer-reviewed, data-based, looking at specific practices and resulted in some practices that we could identify. These were, of course, English language articles, and so we know we have not captured the universe of of recommended practices. We coded those articles. I was part of the group that did this work, and we, even though we were now funded and could provide some support for people who helped us out, we still relied heavily on volunteers. We coded the articles by methodology and used that coding system to then come up with the practices. We were very generous in what articles we looked at. We didn't limit ourselves to just experimental studies, group studies, randomized control trials. We have another group in the United States that only looks at randomized control trials. And we said, no, in our field, there are lots of ways that people are identifying what works, and we need to look at all of that research. So we looked at group quantitative, we looked at single subject studies, we looked at correlational studies, we looked at qualitative studies and mixed method designs. At the same time, we also continued to have some focus groups because we still wanted to hear about the professional knowledge and wisdom of our colleagues and not to limit ourselves to just what the experimental research said. And then we synthesized that together. Once again, we conducted a field validation, and the validation resulted in similar results, that all the practices were identified as recommended practices, and there was a similar discrepancy between what was recommended and what is actually seen every day. This time we almost halved it. So we had 240 practices, because one of the things that people said was 415 is way too many. Can you make it fewer? So we had 240 practices. About a third of them were based on professional knowledge and wisdom, and about 2/3 were supported by empirical literature as well as professional knowledge and wisdom. We had, in that period of time, an increase in the research literature. There's a real bounce in terms of the number of published studies that were relevant to our review. That gave us a couple of books. This is the first book that we published as a result of that process, and this was a listing of the recommended practices along with some additional contextual information. And then in 2005, we published this version, exactly the same practices, but here we gave much more information about implementation. How do you use these practices? What does it take? And we had increasingly heard from the field that now we know we have a better idea of the practices, but how do I make that happen in my classroom or in that program? What if my supervisor doesn't know those practices? What if we don't have the resources to fully implement? So we put together this second book that was a more comprehensive look of how to not only know what the practices are, but how to implement them. Well, we know that recommended practices can't be static. That was one of the reasons why we called them recommended rather than best practices. We know that they need to be updated regularly, and that we know that the evidence is accumulating and in some cases changing, and that there are a variety of ways that the practices might change. So as an organization, we had to think about how were we going to do that. We are still an all-volunteer organization. Sometimes we have financial support from grants and other means, but usually we're relying on the goodwill of the members of the organization. So we set out to, in 2012, to review the practices again, but also to figure out a system where we can periodically review and update. So it won't be a matter of a few people saying, okay, it's time to do it again, but rather there's a system in place. And that's what, we have a new version of the practices now. But we also are putting together this system about how can we kind of ensure that periodically these will be reviewed and updated. So that's one of the two of the reasons why we wanted to do this third version. Wanted to update the practices. We wanted to put a system in place. But, excuse me, for people in the field, for teachers and therapists, probably the most important thing that they said was, there's still too many of them. 240 is way too many to remember. It even takes too long to read through them all. How can we make this much more manageable? So can you reduce it even further? And so as members of the Recommended Practices Commission, we put together a process to revise the practices, and we had a little bit of financial support from the federal government that went to a national technical assistance center called the Early Childhood Technical Assistance Center. And what a name. And they are assisting us with some of the logistics and also with the implementation pieces related to that. Okay, so we set a set of parameters and criteria that were intended to inform both this revision, but revisions in the future. We put together a statement about what the practices are intended to be. They're developed to provide guidance to practitioners and families about the most effective ways to improve the learning outcomes and promote the development of young children, birth through 5 being the age at which most children are then moving into are in kindergarten, and at age 6 into grade 1. For children birth through 5 who have or are at risk for developmental delays or disabilities. Our intention is to continue to use the best available evidence and the wisdom and experience of the field. An underlying principle is that these practices should support access and participation in inclusive settings and natural environments. And we want to infuse greater attention to the cultural, linguistic, and ability diversity throughout all of the practices. And we finally winnowed down the list of topics to 8 topic areas that I'll show you in a second. But the intention is to view these practices holistically. They're all supposed to be used together, but they're organized into 8 topic areas or categories. And so the practices are organized into some that are related to leadership, some that are related to the learning environment, a few that are related to family-centered practice, some that are related to instruction, the actual interaction between teacher and child. Some are related to interactions, teacher-child, child-child, and parent-child interaction. Some related to teaming and collaboration. And the 8th category is transition. And this category has to do with the various not transitions from one activity to another that you see in a classroom, but rather the kind of administrative transitions that happen for young children with disabilities in the United States. So the transition into early intervention program for infants and toddlers, the transition from early intervention into preschool that happens at age 3, and the transition that happens from preschool services into the usual public school time period, either at kindergarten or grade 1. So we have some transitions that are different from yours, but they're really important because we all know how stressful and unsettling any transition can be. So we identified practices in that area. We put together some parameters about how to do this work. So the commission of a group of about 15 people, diverse people, researchers, higher education faculty, family members, practitioners, administrators, put together, identified this list of topics that I just showed you. We said that our primary target are those that provide direct support to children and families, and those are practitioners, teachers and therapists, and also the program directors and supervisors. And then there are others who are important and are recipients and users of the practices, and those include higher education faculty and researchers, policymakers at both the state and federal level, and training and technical assistance providers. So that kind of framed what we were going to do on our audience. This is a very too detailed list of the parameters that we put in place for thinking about these practices. We identified our age group, birth to age 5, who have or are at risk for developmental delays and disabilities. So not just those children who already have a diagnosis or already have an individual education program or an IFSP, but those children who are at risk for delays, or particularly those who are at risk for later school failure. We wanted them to be based on all of our prior work, so we weren't starting from ground zero. We were basing them on the prior work. We also recognized that there's good work that's been done for the larger population of young children and identifying practices that should be in place for all children. We call those developmentally appropriate practices. So we base our work with the assumption that those developmentally appropriate practices will be in place, and then for children with special needs, what else needs to be in place. Taking to heart this notion that the field wanted us to reduce the number of practices, we focused on what we tried to find the best word, what were the essential practices, or those that would give us the biggest bang for our buck, or high leverage practices. They are not disability specific. So these are not for children with autism, not just for children with Down syndrome, not just for children who are visually impaired. They're for children who have developmental delays or disabilities or are at risk. They're supported by research. They're intended to represent the breadth of those topic areas. Practices are expected to be observable. They can be delivered in all of the sorts of settings where children are enrolled and participating, including inclusive environments. And they're written from the perspective of those people who will do the work, written in an active voice, and we tried to make them consistent across categories. The process took place in a number of iterations. We repeated the process several times to both identify practices and get them down to a manageable few. So the commission set out the topic areas and identified the work group leaders who were recognized leaders in the field, the work group leaders who were organized by each of those topic areas, assessment, instruction, and so forth. They put together their work group, and that work group met virtually to identify the practices and to identify the research evidence in support of those practices. They brought those back to the commission reviewed them, they went back out to the topic area, and we repeated that process several times until we were kind of satisfied with our list of practices. And then they went to another group that looked at whether or not the nominated evidence was sound and sufficient. So another group of people, another group of volunteers, looked at the research evidence that was nominated in support of the practice, and they conducted a series of activities to look at whether or not there was sufficient evidence, whether the evidence that was selected was rigorous enough, strong enough. And another important part of that, what we call the evidence synthesis group, was a gap analysis to find out those practices that are often well regarded and always appear when we have people nominate practices, but may not have much research evidence to support it. So, for example, working on family identified goals. That appears in all of our policies, it appears in the law. It has not been subjected necessarily to rigorous research. So we wanted to identify gaps as well as the research support. We also had this big research systematic review that we had conducted for the previous edition, so we built on that, and we did a alignment, a crosswalk to make sure that we were using that research. And then in the second part of this work, we have identified more research support and the gaps, and we're putting together a process that I'll talk about in a minute that will continue the work. And that's just one of the coding forms that we used. Okay, so we ended up with a set of practices. We sent them out once again to the same designed field review of 800 participants. And once again, they were validated as these are important, these are the recommended practices. We did a little bit better in terms of whether or not people saw them in everyday practice, but we still don't see them all the time, you know that. And then we released them in 2014, and there are 66 practices, so we got it down. I don't know if that's a manageable number, but it's smaller. And in previous times, we had published these as a book, of course. But times have changed, right? So now they're available free and downloadable on the DEC website, and they're really not very thick anymore. This is just the set of practices. I'll show you the website in a second. Another part of that, our continuing work, is to develop the professional development resources to make sure that, in fact, we can help teachers, therapists, and others in programs implement these practices. And then putting together this process that continues the work, relying heavily on researchers in the field and their graduate students. So we're putting together a systematic process of what it means to do a review of the literature, clarifying the practice, doing the search so that we do these searches consistently, and then putting together kind of a brief statement in support of the practice, and then the student and their mentor can use that review and publish it. So that's the reward, the reinforcement for graduate students and their mentors to participate. But we're trying to put that in place so that we can continue to review the practices on a regular basis. Okay. So very briefly, let me give you a sense of what these practices look like, and we'll look at the instruction practices. Remember from our review about inclusion, specialized instruction is essential. It's a cornerstone of effective inclusion. And every topic, every domain is introduced, and instruction says the purpose of instruction, recommended practices, is to help children acquire the skills and behaviors that will help them be more independent and successful as young children and throughout their lives. And they're essentially the tools of our trade. The instruction practices are intended to be used across disciplines, not just by the special education teacher, but by the teachers, assistant teachers, therapists, and others who are working with the child and family. They should incorporate child-family priorities. They focus on intentional, systematic, individualized instruction, and they're in these areas that I already showed you: modifications, embedded teaching, also peer-mediated instruction, and specialized or intensive instruction. They also include database decision-making, and they should be used not just narrowly as instruction practices, but with all of the other practices as well. There are 13 in this category, and this is a very brief description of each of those 13. What was new about this version is that the instruction practices called out children who are dual language learners. That's what the term we use for children whose home language is not English. And so that's an increasing population, and with children with some unique needs, and were not being attended to as they should be. And so there are a couple of practices that have to do with supporting children's home language while they're also learning English, and paying attention to some adaptations that may be needed for those children who are dual language learners and have disabilities. So in our publications, we list each of the practices. This is number 4. Practitioners plan for and provide the level of support, accommodations, and adaptations needed for the child to access, participate, and learn within and across activities and routines. Then there are some examples, trying to help people understand what that practice means. And the examples are written for teachers, they're written for therapists, they're written for administrators. Here's just another example. So instruction practice number 6 says, practitioners use systematic instructional strategies with fidelity to teach skills and to promote child engagement and learning. And again, examples are given. Also, since this is on the website, there's an interactive glossary, because we know lots of times we're using language that is, filled with jargon, or it's technical, or it may not be a term that's familiar to the teacher or the administrator. And so you can just click on a word, and for a lot of them, the definition will then come up. So there are some tools and tricks that were not available in previous editions. Well, one of the things that I'm going to close with is that some of you know that I have, that as part of our work on that Early Childhood Research Institute on Inclusion, when we were studying inclusion and looking at facilitators and barriers to preschool inclusion, we were in lots of classrooms. And we put together a framework to help us think about how does the teaching team think about how they plan and organize and deliver their instruction and their intervention for young children with disabilities and special needs. And we thought of this as a tiered system of support. And lots of other people were kind of working concurrently on other projects. And this is really how people who are working with children with special needs, whether they're in special education or not, children who are vulnerable, there are lots of efforts that are using this idea of tiered systems of support or levels of support. And the idea being that for all children, we should have a sound, solid foundation. And then for some children, we'll need to make some kind of modifications or adaptations, usually fairly simple, but for some children that will be sufficient. And then for a few children, we may have to do some more specialized in teaching, maybe some embedded teaching and learning. And for a very few children, at the top of this, in our case, a block tower, but sometimes it's a triangle, sometimes it's a pyramid, we have highly specialized intensive instruction. And so this is what it looks like in our framework that we refer to as building blocks. And these are the names that we've given to these tiers, and they're comparable to other frameworks, other tiered frameworks. We say build on a quality early childhood program for all children. Perhaps you'll need to make some modifications or adaptations for some children, provide embedded teaching and learning opportunities, or more targeted instruction for a few children. And for a very few children, you may need to use child-focused instructional strategies or intensive interventions. And then we have been working a lot with Head Start programs. Those are the programs for children at risk for school failure, children who are growing up in poverty. And we've been working with a lot of folks who are really trying to understand what that foundational block looks like. And so that's broken down as well, to looking at the social and emotional supports that need to be in place for all children. What are the learning environments need to look like for all children? We call that well-organized classrooms. And what are those interactions between the adults and the teachers, adults and the children and the children? What are the nature of those interactions for all children? So we're getting actually more information, more specificity about this foundational block. And then, as I've mentioned, there's lots of work in place to think about what additional guidance or tools are needed by teachers, therapists, and administrators in order to implement the practices. And those are just some of them that have already been developed and in the works. The Division for Early Childhood has on its website some of these books and tools and tip sheets and modules and things. And I wanted to mention that one of the things that we want to look at is, how do we measure quality? Are we implementing? Do we have these things in place? And the Inclusive Classroom Profile is one tool that can be used. In addition, the self-reflection tool that was developed by the European agency is also a useful tool for programs to use to look at the nature of inclusion. It has many of the same indicators, and so it's also a good and useful tool. And then finally, I wanted to mention that in my current work, we have a group called the Early Edu Alliance at the University of Washington, and we are creating professional development materials, primarily online and in-person courses designed to increase and improve the skills and behaviors of the early childhood workforce, the teachers for all children, and that those preparation efforts will also include the inclusive recommended practices that I've been talking about today. So there you go. Thank you.